Forbes Books presents Sustainable Leadership and Disruptive Growth with David Radlo. Transformation for a new and better world. Here's David.
I'm honored to be joined this week by Dr. Ben Carson. Ben is a groundbreaking neurosurgeon who served as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development from 2017 to 2021. You might recall he was also a candidate for president in the 2016 Republican primaries. Currently, he's the chairman of the American Cornerstone Institute and an author of several books, including his new and most timely book, Created Equal. Mr. Secretary, Dr. Carson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
In your books, Gifted Hands and Created Equal, you shared some of your humble beginnings and background arising from poverty in Detroit and Boston, including incidents of clear racism with threats to schooling, playing football, and honors received. You also mentioned how you were able to get some surprising, mystical, and extraordinary gifts. A note after falling asleep traveling with your wife, Candy, going 90 miles an hour in a car earlier in your life, how a dream helped you through a key test while at Yale, in addition, as well as the difficult surgeries and political attacks. On faith, Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Trouble will come upon you. Disappointment will rain on your door like a tidal wave. If you don't have a deep and patient faith, you ain't going to make it." How important has faith been in your life, and how has it navigated you through such as these difficult situations and to becoming the expert worldwide neurosurgeon that handle conjoined twins and other extraordinarily difficult situations?
Well, I would dare say that I couldn't do any of that without the incredible faith that has brought me through so many trials. I hearken back to the fact that I had a horrible temper, and I would just go fly off the handle and want to seek revenge, harm people, regardless of the consequences. It was after such an incident where I tried to stab another teenager with a camping knife that I was locked in the bathroom and I was thinking about my life. I turned things around academically very significantly, but I knew I would never achieve my dream of becoming a doctor with a temper like that. I would end up in jail, reform school, or the grave. And I just said, Lord, I can't control my temper. And there was a Bible there, and I picked it up, and there were all these verses in the book of Proverbs about anger and also about fools, and they all seemed like they were written about me. For 3 hours, I prayed and contemplated and read, and it dawned on me during that time, it was always about me, my, and I. Somebody did this to me. They took my thing. I want this. I said, if you learn how to step out of the center of the equation, let it be about somebody else, you won't be angry. That was the last day I had an angry outburst. And I recognized at that point, God was real. He was more than somebody you learned about in church. And it really changed my life. And I began to really depend on him at that point in time. And it's been something that has gotten me through so many trials. You know, when I was a first-year medical student, I did poorly on the first set of comprehensive exams, and I was sent to see my counselor, who said, "You seem like a very intelligent young man. I bet there's a lot you could do outside of medicine." And he tried to convince me to drop out of medical school. He said I wasn't cut out for medicine. And I would just torment myself and everybody else, and they could help me get into another discipline. The only thing I'd wanted to do was be a doctor since I was 8 years old. I started thinking, what kind of courses have you always done well in, and what kind of courses have you struggled in? And I realized I did very well in courses where I did a lot of reading, and I struggled in courses where I listened to a lot of boring lectures, because I don't get anything out of boring lectures, nothing at all. And yet there I was, 6 to 8 hours a day, sitting in boring lectures. So I made an executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend that time reading. And the rest of medical school was a snap after that. And some years later, when I was back at my medical school as a commencement speaker, I was looking for that counselor because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be a counselor. Because so many people are just negative. They never seem to be able to figure out a positive thing to say.
Thanks for sharing that positive, transformative experience due to your great faith. As you mentioned on life, Martin Luther King discussed the 3 dimensions of a complete life and the onward push for fulfillment, helping others, and the upward reach for God. Dr. King preached loving your enemies with agape and finding what's good in your enemies and finding what's wrong with yourself on the road to being judged by your content and your character and not your skin color. He spoke about even in prison finding out how much white jail guards made and they should perhaps join his movement. You said that in America, we valued each individual as unique being and someone who can bring a special perspective to the table so we can work together to come up with common sense solutions to problems and believe that we've progressed to a point where many African American businesses, political doctors, and other professionals and trades, where people are more open-minded about each other and believe that people are indeed created equal. Can you kindly comment on certain common sense solutions that you have been involved with to address underserved communities that improve lives, as well as other key lessons learned from your career?
One of the things that has been very important to me is the whole concept of self-sufficiency. And that was really the reason that I wanted to take a job as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. There were so many things that were built into the system that kept people dependent. I worked very hard to enhance and improve and expand programs that would lead to self-sufficiency so that when people, for instance, made more money on the job, instead of having to report that so that your rent could go up, you would report it, but instead of the rent going up, the extra money could go into an escrow. And over the course of a few years, you might be able to accumulate enough for a down payment on your own house. And home ownership is the principal mechanism of wealth accumulation in this country. The average net worth of a renter is $5,000. The average net worth of a homeowner is $200,000. It's a 40-fold difference. And in many cases, we're talking about the same money that is used to either be squandered or to go into creating that nest egg. Those are the kinds of things that really make a difference in people's lives. And then, we've worked very hard to create a Carson Scholars Fund, in which we recognize students from all backgrounds who achieve at the highest academic levels and also who care about other people. You have to do both. We give them rewards, including scholarships as early as the 4th grade, so that the other kids look at them and instead of that old nerd, wow, that kid had a scholarship. He's only in the 4th or the 5th grade. What the heck did he do? And a lot of teachers tell us other kids start trying harder at that point. And then we also put in reading rooms, and that's absolutely critical. There's over 260 of them now around the country, primarily in Title I schools, where a lot of kids come from homes with few or no books. They go to schools that don't have a budget of significance for libraries. Those kids are not likely to become readers, but you put these incredible rooms in the school with all kinds of fascinating books. The rooms are decorated frequently in a way that's consistent with the area where they're found. For instance, one that's near a Nassau site is decorated like a space capsule. You look through one window, you see the Earth, another one you see the moon, another one you see E.T. And the kids just love these places, and they get points for the number of books they read, and they can trade them in for prizes. But in the beginning, they're interested in the prizes, but it doesn't take long before that begins to affect their academic achievement. And many studies have shown us that if a child is reading at grade level by grade 3, it changes the trajectory of their lives. That's what it's really all about. We're made in the image of God, tremendous potential, but it has to be directed correctly.
I appreciate the thoughtful introspection. Turning to systematic racism, you stated by taking every incident of perceived racial discrimination and magnifying it, repeating it incessantly, the case for systematic racism is made. The guilt and shame is done to manipulate the public. Could you then please explain for our listeners as to why there are calls there for systematic racism, Black and minority victimization, and critical race theory and related calls to defund rather than support the police?
Well, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to defund the police under any circumstances. But, you take something like the George Floyd incident. It was repeated incessantly to the point that we have some friends who live in Australia, and we talked to them, and they said, "What's happening? The police are killing all the black men over there." You would think that was going on from what you were saying, when in fact, the actual numbers of unarmed black men who are killed by police in a year, according to that paragon of conservative thought, the Washington Post, is less than 24 a year, closer to 12. Any number is obviously a tragedy, but it's nowhere near what people think. And in a lot of surveys where you go out and ask people how many are killed, they're talking hundreds, maybe 1,000, when it's nothing like that. By magnifying it, talking about it all the time, you make it seem that way. That is something that is really a responsibility of the news media. Instead of reporting the news in an unbiased way like they're supposed to, they pick sides and they try to manipulate people, forgetting that the reason that they're the only business protected by our Constitution is because they were supposed to report unbiased information to the people so that the people could decide what their will was, because the country was to be run on the will of the people, not on the will of some monarch or some ruling body.
Along those lines, you said rather than blaming everything on systematic racism, our failing cities should consider an appropriate support for law enforcement and investment in education, especially in economically deprived areas. Can you expand a little further on that?
First of all, recognize that if we don't have law enforcement, we have total chaos. Can you imagine what it would be like to live in a society where there are no police? Someone would just come into your house and say, "I like that flat screen TV. I think I'm going to take it." Better still, "I like your house. You get out, I'll take it." It would be whoever is the strongest and the meanest would be the ruler. That's sort of like the way it is in the wild jungle. And so obviously we need these people. Are there good ones and bad ones? Of course, the vast majority of them are good. But, there are rotten apples in every profession: medicine, journalism, teaching, law, whatever. There's always rotten apples. When it happens in law enforcement, we seem to be very quick to generalize as opposed to recognizing that they're just bad apples in other areas. And that's something that obviously needs to change. We also need to work with the police in terms of understanding the best and safest ways of law enforcement. And, I talked in the book Created Equal about some of the new technologies that have been developed, such as the bowler wrap, which shoots a web-like material very rapidly and wraps somebody up, sort of like a spider web. And they're immobilized. They can't do anything. It is a heck of a lot better than shooting them. And it's much more effective than tasing them. And, we need to continue to develop these kinds of things, deploy them and use them so that we don't have these situations where people end up being shot, like the young man in Atlanta who was running away from the police and, was killed from behind. That was completely unnecessary. And certainly if he'd had the bowler wrap, it would not have happened at all.
Hey, you said when I look at black youths, we are among minorities to stand on our own 2 feet and refuse to look to anyone else to save us. Kind of tough, isn't it?
I guess I grew up in a tough environment. I had a mother who never accepted excuses. And anytime an excuse came out of our mouth, the next thing out of her mouth was a poem called Yourself to Blame. And the next question after that was, do you have a brain? And if the answer was yes, then you could have thought your way out of it. It doesn't matter what John or Susan or Mary or Stephen or anybody else said or did. And when you grow up in that kind of environment, You're not an excuse maker. You're a solution finder. And that's what we have to teach people. There's a reason that you have these incredible brains. Billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections, the ability to remember everything you've ever seen or heard, the ability to process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. With something like that, you don't need to be looking for excuses. You need to be looking for solutions. How do you solve this problem? And then, when it comes to racism, my mother had an incredible philosophy. She would say, if you walk into an auditorium full of racist, bigoted people, you don't have a problem. They have a problem. Because they're all going to cringe and wonder if you're going to sit next to them, whereas you can sit anywhere you want. And, with a philosophy like that, you just move forward. And any obstacle you see, it becomes a hurdle. You jump over and it makes you stronger for the next one.
Is that how you grew your view of resilience outweighing victimhood?
Absolutely. We all get to make a choice. We can choose whether we're going to be victims or whether we're going to be victors. It's completely a matter of your philosophy and the way that you think. And it makes a real big difference in terms of what happens to you in life.
You mentioned and referred to the Brookings Institute that if your incidents of poverty are in the 3% range, if you finish high school, get married, wait to have kids until getting married, and get a job. Would you be kind enough to expand on this?
Those are the things that we used to know. That was a time we didn't require the Brookings Institute or some other institute to actually spell it out and do research. Obviously, finish high school, get your basic educational foundation so that you can function in society, so that you can read and fill out an application, so that you can understand basic instructions, so that you can communicate well with other people. That's essential for success. Get married, have a foundation. A strong family foundation is a huge advantage for virtually anything that you're ever going to do. Having people that you can trust and people that you can count on. And waiting till you're married to have children. Basically what that's saying is learning to plan rather than just to react to things. And obviously that's going to be better for you. It's going to be a lot better for the children. We were married for 8 years before we had our first child. Why? Because we got married after my second year in medical school. And I still had 2 more years of medical school and several years of residency. And the kids wouldn't have known me. They would have said, Mommy, that strange man was here again. That's not good. So we waited until I was finished with my residency before we had children. God gives us the ability to plan those things out.
Planning certainly can make a tremendous difference. Turning to liberty, you mentioned concerns with media and big tech. You noted the shining moment with the media aiding Dr. King and the civil rights movement. But now, are big threats to liberty with tyranny?
The media was extremely helpful during the civil rights period because people didn't know what was going on and they wouldn't have believed it if you had just said it. But they were actually able to see it. They were actually able to see those water hoses turned on children and dogs attacking people and people being brutally beaten. It makes a difference. If you have a heart at all and you realize that these people are only trying to have basic human rights and that you have all these people doing everything they can to prevent that from happening, that changes public opinion very, very rapidly. And kudos to the news media for being involved in that. But now they've decided, instead of just reporting the news, let's try to formulate people's opinion around what we believe is the right way. And they've accepted a very left-wing agenda about who we are as a nation, that we're evil, that we're systemically racist, that we're unfair to people, and that the world is going to end because of global climate change. And all of these things, and they're advocating and pushing these things when in fact it's not true. Have we always been a perfect nation? No, no nation has. No nation that's inhabited by human beings, because human beings are imperfect. That's why we need a savior. But when you look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of America and American history, there's a lot more good than there is bad and ugly. But some people, including much of the news media, choose to focus on the bad and ugly, on slavery and things of that nature, and say that we're uniquely evil because that existed here, when in fact slavery existed in virtually every continent with every civilization. The thing that makes us unique is that we had so many people who were vehemently against it that we fought a bloody civil war and lost a large portion of our population to get rid of it. And, as far as global warming is concerned, or global cooling, or global change, you can call it whatever you want to try to fit the ideology. When the environment stops changing, that's when we all die.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. I lived in suburban Boston after Sam Cunningham and USC beat Alabama in Alabama, and was part of a community that welcomed some great students and athletes that came out to study, play sports, and host from Boston are great friends in our homes after the racial tension surfaced during the forced busing issues in the 1970s. Later, my daughter and son were fortunate enough to live in a military town where meritocracy ruled. Can you talk about the positive strides we've made since the civil rights movement?
First of all, recognize that just in my lifetime, America has changed dramatically. When I was a little kid, I remember it was a big deal when somebody came on television that was black in a non-servile role. You called everybody in. It was a great deal of excitement. And now, in that same lifetime, we have black admirals and generals and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and heads of foundations and university presidents, including Ivy League. We've had a black president elected twice and a black vice president. The list goes on. And that's in one lifetime. You talk about a society with the ability to make great changes quickly. That's a very good example of it. We should be looking at those improvements and building on that, rather than trying to tear our society down and talk about how horrible we are. If we're that horrible a society, if we're that unfair to people, why the heck is everybody trying to come in through our southern border? Why are they trying to get here? And when they get here, why don't they call all their friends and relatives? If they don't come here, it's a horrible place. Of course, that's not happening because it's not fair.
Veracity does matter. Let's move on to the American Cornerstone Institute, where you list several items that need to improve, focusing on life, liberty, community, and faith, including equal opportunity for all, energy independence, adherence to the Constitution, protection of the electrical grid, care for those that can't care for themselves, border security, mounting debt, environmental stability. Could you care to comment further on this?
The point being that we have a lot of problems, and we need to be dealing logically with those problems rather than fighting each other. We, the American people, are not each other's enemies. We are very foolish to allow the purveyors of division and hatred to be able to manipulate us into thinking, because of political differences or other differences, that we are each other's enemies, that we should be canceled, that you can say anything you want and harm people and their families. That is the formula for destruction. Jesus said it best: a house divided against itself cannot stand. Abraham Lincoln repeated it. And that's what's going on. So, we need to learn how to take our differences and sit down at the table and discuss them and come up with mutually satisfactory solutions. That's why we have these big frontal lobes and these complex brains. So when we're dealing with something like energy, we don't have to sit on one side of the table and say, green energy, renewable energy, and that's what it's going to be, and too bad for anything else. Or sit on the other side and say, fossil fuels are the salvation of the world, and let's just make sure we use them all up. Instead, let's sit down and talk together and say, renewable energy, green energy is desirable, and progress in energy is desirable. Are we ready to turn completely to it right now? Do we have the infrastructure to support it? No. Do we have a lot of fossil fuels, and have we learned how to use them in a clean way? And were we able to become energy independent and a net exporter of energy so that we protect the financial structure of our country and of so many families? Why don't we sit down and figure out how we can use what we have to get what we want rather than fighting each other? That would be what intelligent people would do. That would be how they would solve these problems. When you look at something like our border and people just flooding across, and we have government officials saying, there's no problem at the border. It's all a figment of your imagination. There's no problem. Well, of course, anybody with half a brain knows that's not true. There's a big problem. But we have ways of dealing with that. We need to control our border. We need to establish a guest worker program, because a lot of the people who live south of the border, they just want a better life for themselves and for their families. I can't blame them for that. But we have a mechanism whereby we can do that with a healthy guest worker program. They come, they work, they pay taxes, they come and go as they please. And if they want to become an American citizen, they go through the same thing that anybody else would go through to become an American citizen. That's what intelligent people would do, rather than making it into a gigantic problem. And the same goes for virtually any of the problems that you mentioned. There are completely logical and reasonable solutions that people from different viewpoints can arrive at if they're just willing to sit down and talk.
Makes sense. Actually sitting down and dealing with stuff instead of just shouting past each other. You spoke about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should be front and center, and wary of restrictions on freedoms. You even went as strong to say that jihadists identify infidels and either convert or kill them. Is that the way media and politics right now is going? And what's your comments on that? And how do you think it should change?
Well, it is frightening to see that political philosophies are driving some of our law enforcement efforts, how the FBI is being used to persecute certain people depending on their political philosophy, and completely ignore wrongdoing by other people depending on their political philosophy. Utilizing our law enforcement agencies in this way is laying the foundation for total chaos and destruction. And it needs to be addressed as quickly as it possibly can be, because it will destroy the foundations of our democratic society. And demonizing those with whom we disagree, saying that if these people are put into office, democracy will end, and all that kind of just absolute garbage, and frightening people, rather than sitting down and recognizing that we have a society that's composed of many different people with many different beliefs. And a one-size-fits-all philosophy does not work in that kind of society. And therefore, you need to be cognizant of what the differences are, and simple enough to be able to sit down and work on things that make sense for all the people.
Sometimes community and liberty sometimes can collide. As former head of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, where you shared your extraordinary gifts, there's been a movement in the United States headed by Dr. Chris Nowinski, Robert Cantu of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, to improve children's lives by, quote, stop hitting kids in the head with full contact football, heading in soccer, and full contact rugby due to pre-concussive hits that cause CTE. Meanwhile, certain parent groups have fought this as taking away parental choice and liberty. What do you do when liberty and life, for example, intersects? Where does Dr. Carson stand on this issue?
I stand on the side of liberty, but also on the side of dissemination of knowledge. For instance, when we're dealing with COVID and vaccines, is it better to mandate that people have to do something? Or is it better to give people accurate information and let them work with their healthcare provider, since everybody is different and has different risks? So I think people are intelligent enough to make wise choices, provided that they are given the full scope of information, not slanted information about what is happening. And that, unfortunately, is what the CDC and NIH have engaged in, and it has poisoned the atmosphere and the trust that people have in our government healthcare agencies.
You gave a new concept at looking at race differently. Is it racism or classism? Could you kindly explain the difference for our listeners that haven't really delved into this concept before?
There is a lot of classism in our country. There's a lot of classism around the world. People of high socioeconomic status frequently don't want to deal with people of low socioeconomic status for a variety of reasons. One of which is, people expect them to give to them. Sometimes they have just different sets of values. But unfortunately, a lot of people of color fall into the lower socioeconomic strata. They find that people are treating them differently, and they think it's because of their race, when in fact, if their socioeconomic status was much higher, those people would treat them quite differently. And a lot of people just don't understand the difference there. It shouldn't be a problem. We shouldn't be racist or classist. But, the fact of the matter is, it does exist, and we need to acknowledge that it exists and understand it in order to put things in perspective.
Worth remembering that thought. Now, Ben, a common theme in our podcast has been partners at home. All my guests gush about their spouses. We're a big part of their success, and you're no different. You mentioned Candy's dad's cousin was Bayard Rustin, her maiden name, a founding pioneer in the civil rights movement, founding the SCLC with Dr. King. More than that, could you kindly tell me about the effect that Candy has had on your life?
Well, when I was a senior in college, I decided that it was time for me to stop resisting relationships. And so I said to God, Lord, I'm going to stop resisting relationships. So let the next one be the right one. And the next one was Candy. And a lot of people who knew both of us before we knew each other were always saying, you two should be together. They could see something about us that was so similar. And in fact, once we started going together, we were virtually inseparable. Even when I was medical school for 2 years and she was still at Yale, we were always on the phone. We wrote to each other every day. I remember one time we talked on the telephone for 6 hours, and we dreaded the bill, but we never got it. I think the telephone company said this was a mistake and they crossed it out. But she has been so supportive of everything that I've ever done. She's incredibly smart. And I'll tell you what kind of person she is. I love to play pool. She didn't know how to play pool. She learned how to play pool. She said, that's the only way I'm going to have really good quality time with you. And now she's an excellent pool player. We both love music, and that's what really brought us together. She's a classical violinist that also plays lots of other instruments and sings. And that brought us together, and it still keeps us very much in harmony with each other every day.
We can all agree our greatest achievement is raising a family, and you're a proud parent and grandparent. and we featured one of your kids, Ben Jr., and his wife, Merlin. Ben is involved in private equity, investing in minority businesses to reduce the racial wealth gap. And Merlin, a medical doctor in the medical technology entrepreneurship space. Kind of makes you proud, doesn't it?
It's been absolutely wonderful. First of all, they all got married in 2011, all three sons. They've all produced wonderful grandchildren. They're all successful in what they do, and they care about other people. None of them's ever been in any trouble with the law or with anybody else. They respect other people. They get along well with other people. BJ in particular, who you interviewed, has become incredibly successful financially, but also in terms of creating opportunities for other people.
In Gifted Hands, you stated to think big. Talent, time, hope, honesty, insight, nice, knowledge, books, in-depth learning, and God. Please kindly cover appropriately your thoughts, and your niceness is, I may say, is exceedingly refreshing.
It is so important that we learn to respect other people and to be nice to them. And the interesting thing is, if you're nice to people, once they get over their suspicion of why you're being nice, they'll be nice to you. And you can get so much more done when you're being nice and they're being nice. It's a lot easier. It takes a lot more energy and effort not to be nice to people. And, you think about how this country developed. Early on, there were all these small communities, 20 families, 50 families, 100 families, isolated from anybody else, nobody else around for 25, 50, 100 miles. Not only did they survive, but they thrived. Why were those communities able to thrive? Because they used their different skills and talents collectively for the good of the whole community. They were nice to each other. They took care of each other. If it was harvest time, Mr. Johnson broke his leg, everybody else harvested his crops, no questions asked. That was the kind of spirit that was prevalent in our society. It still exists in some portions of America. We have a farm in rural Maryland, and people out in that neck of the woods, very nice. I remember one time we were having some work done at our house, and we had some materials that were very exotic, and they were brought all the way down from Canada on an 18-wheeler, very heavy. But when they got there, they realized they didn't have a forklift, so there was no way to unload it. And one of our neighbors owns a heavy equipment company, sent over a forklift, did all the work, wouldn't take a penny for it. Those kinds of people still exist. They're all around, and we need to make sure that we become those kind of people.
There are many salt-of-the-earth people in rural America, and fortunately, you can find some in cities and suburbs as well.
Absolutely.
Anything else I'd missed, and more information on the American Cornerstone Institute and Ben Carson, and the way where we can get to your podcast and your great books?
Yes, I would encourage people to go to AmericanCornerstone.org. We have a whole host of programs there, including a lot of interviews of government officials talking about how the government actually works, because we want to encourage people, young people in college, congressional staffers, etc., to want to get into the executive branch of government as career employees and to stay there and to help to formulate good policies and push good policies in our country. We also have a pediatric component called Little Patriots. It has lessons K through 5 on the real history of our country and the real principles of our founding. The good, the bad, and the ugly, but there's a lot more good than there is bad and ugly. And we have the Star Spangled Adventure series. New cartoon series comes out every month teaching certain things about our history, like there was one on the Boston Tea Party, one on the Declaration of Independence, etc. And they're done extremely well. We hired some of the best animators from Pixar, ABC Kids, and Disney. And they put together absolutely fascinating stuff that has lesson plans with it. It's great for parents and grandparents to go through with kids. It's also designed for schools, home schools, public, private schools. But when you look at it, you say, wow, this is very expensive. And it's true, it is very expensive. But we've had it underwritten by patriots, and therefore it's absolutely 100% free.
Oh, that's quite special. That really is. I can't thank you enough, Mr. Secretary, Dr. Carson, for sharing and taking the time with us, and hopefully I know all the listeners and myself have really appreciated it, and we've learned an awful lot.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for being a patient.
To connect with David, go to davidradlo.com. David's book set, The Principles of Cartel Disruption and Secret Stories of Leadership, Growth, and Innovation, are available wherever books are sold. This has been Sustainable Leadership and Disruptive Growth with David Radlo, a presentation of Forbes Books.